Monday mornings at this time on a weekly basis. In fact, we've never missed a Monday to my knowledge other than a holiday. We're joined by Randy Staples from Idaho Weekly Briefing, and he has a breakdown usually every week of some of the best stories politically as well as just other news taking place around the state of Idaho. It's 32, 844. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and News Radio 1310.com. And Randy, first of all, welcome back.
Good to be here.
I do confess that I read your column before I actually see it in the briefing. I usually read it in the Press Tribune or somewhere else. But I know we're here to not necessarily promote all of the other newspapers in the state. It's you have your own central publication as well. And very quickly, for those tuning in, how would they find the briefing?
They could check it out at www.ridenbaugh.com. That's RIDENBAUGH.
Your column yesterday dealt with that huge turnout among Democrats for a caucus and trying to really explain what happened because Democrat leadership that you talked to did not foresee this happening, and yet it just was overwhelming in favor of Bernie Sanders.
Well, they were starting to get, as I talked to them, they were not entirely shocked in advance by the idea that Bernie Sanders might win. I suspect that a lot of them were a little bit stunned by the margin of it. It was a pretty enormous margin, close to 80% in Idaho, which matched up pretty closely to what it was in Utah, in Washington State, Alaska, and Hawaii. All of these states. It's kind of interesting, this geographic area where you've got some red states and some blue states, each of them doing the same thing. But it was quite an interesting thing, and I think it may take a good number of the party leaders by shock to a degree, because almost all of them, the great majority, were Hillary Clinton supporters.
You know, when we talk about just they're not outliers any longer after you have 5 or 6 going for Bernie Sanders. Plus, many of these same states seem to be in the Ted Cruz camp, which seems to surprise a lot of people. For some reason, this cluster of states is just we're dancing to the beat of our own drummer.
It's well, the two parties operate on different tracks at this stage. They're very much doing their own things. The split between Trump and Cruz, and that was the split in Idaho. Those were the only two that got really strong votes. It was operating really on a very different kind of track than what the Democrats were doing. But they, when you look at the other states, they were kind of split.
When we talk about a caucus versus a primary, I'm now hearing, because of the big turnout, that the Democrats will reconsider maybe even getting involved with the primary to try to bring even more people out versus the caucus setting.
Well, there have been some complaints about the caucus approach, and I think some of those complaints may have been part of what led Republicans this last time around to abandon the caucus approach and go back to a primary. You can't cast absentee ballots at a caucus. You have to be there, physically be there at a given time and place, and if you can't be there at that time and place, you can't vote. And there were people. There is you're probably familiar with the national liberal blog called Daily Cause.
Yes.
One of their main writers, actually, as it happens, lives in Boise, and was looking forward to participating in the Democratic caucus. Was not able to because of employment considerations. She had to be out of town, and so she was unable to go. And that struck me as one of kind of the high ironies of the caucus situation, that you have people like that who are unable to participate.
I wanted to point out, Randy, as well, people just tuning in, if maybe mention it one more time, with the weekly briefing, where would they go?
They would go to www.ridenbaugh.com, RIDENBAUGH.
And it's 8:48. Randy Staples from Idaho Weekly Briefing joining us on Top Story with Bill Colley this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX and News Radio 1310.com, and we're up to 33. A big story coming out. I was surprised on Good Friday. I guess it was Good Friday. The governor signed this bill about a permitless concealed carry in Idaho. We knew I think that the gut feeling was he'd be doing it. Good Friday seemed like an odd placement for it, but he also did this with a bit of a warning, didn't he?
He did. Essentially the bill threw open the capability for anyone, virtually anyone, 21 or older, to carry a concealed weapon in Idaho, and that was certainly, Governor Otter is very much an advocate of people who want to carry firearms, but he had a little bit of a cautionary note in signing it. He pointed out that there is nothing like an educational or training requirement for people who want to do this, as opposed to in many places when you have concealed weapons permits, you have to have some kind of training, some sort of course, maybe something like what the NRA traditionally has done. But this bill does not include anything like that, and he called on the legislature to monitor how this goes over the next year, and maybe look at including some kind of a requirement along those lines if there are problems that develop.
I remember years ago somebody gave me a CD, and it was contained a number of the radio commentaries that Ronald Reagan did when he was in the political wilderness, and in one he's mentioning speaking to college students where he was telling them that when he was a kid, a teenager, you didn't need a driver's license, and he said in my era, when your dad thought you were old enough, he gave you some lessons, and that's how you learned to drive. And of course, culture got much more complex after that, and now we've got licensing and health or driving insurance and all of that. But point he brought up, I remember when I was a kid, my dad took me out and he instructed my brother in firearm safety, and long before we ever got a chance to even target shoot. And when I was in school, in archery, they taught us safety as well. But I guess the concern is here that somebody just simply will, strap a sidearm on without any training and could end up blowing their feet off.
Well, that's and just that kind of thing from time to time happens. We see the stories from around the country where something like that happens. Somebody that doesn't have that kind of training. I mean, traditionally, the kind of thing you're talking about, where you could get some of that kind of training within a family, and probably you ought to be able to challenge it if you can show that you are properly trained in some way or another, even within the family or something like that. That's probably a legitimate way to do it too. But some sort of training, I think, is necessary. There's certainly a fair number of people out now who are not really very aware of how you do safely and properly handle firearms, and that I think that stands to be a problem.
And that was for me growing up in a rural environment, and I would imagine that throughout most of rural Idaho, people do get that sort of family training that we talk about. But that was 40 years ago or more, and I would think that for my own reasonableness would say I should go through a refresher course at some point.
Well, and something like that might not even be a bad idea. I think that sort of thing might not be a bad idea, for that matter, for people who have driver's licenses. People that stay in the same state tend to just kind of re-up, and probably haven't had any kind of a refresher course. And in some cases, people may not have had in decades. It's probably not too bad an idea to do something like that. And you could set it up in such a way that you could do kind of like what you do with getting a driver's license. You could take a test, see whether you seem to be proficient, you seem to understand the safety requirements that you ought to have, and let it go at that. But I suspect that in the suburban areas, not so much in the rural areas, but in the fast-growing suburban areas, you may have a number of people who simply like the idea of running down, picking up a gun, and then they want to do something with it.
I was going to
And
say this is going to be a huge boost, though, for those people who have the training ranges.
Yeah, well, it could, and hopefully people take some advantage of the training opportunities that are out there.
I guess I found a new investment opportunity this morning. Uh, 8:54, Randy Staples from Idaho Weekly Briefing joining us on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and News Radio 1310.com. Bill Colley with you as well on the program this morning. Another thing we wanted to talk about quickly, if we could too, we're going to have a vote in Twin Falls coming up, Twin Falls County in May, which is really just I don't know if we could call it binding or not, but at least we're going to get a public referendum on refugee resettlement. Ada County will not have anything like that, and apparently they were unable to. The folks who are opposed to the program were unable to get that on the ballot.
Well, the Ada County commissioners decided that they were not too interested in something like that either. It's been frankly for some reason or another well, I can partially identify some of the reasons. Not nearly as large an issue in the Ada County area as it has become in Twin Falls County. Twin Falls County, of course, obviously it's become a very big issue. In Ada County, the politics and the discussion, the types of discussion, and the people involved are simply in different categories. Politically, it's quite a bit different, where the partisan splits are a lot different, and what you hear in discussion on the street is a little bit different. So I'm not too surprised that Ada County went in the direction that it did, or that Twin Falls is going in the direction that it is.
Got a couple of minutes before we wrap up this week. We were talking on the telephone before we went on air. We've got one. What you had the House adjourned before the Senate last week, but at this point, did we see any surprises that came out in the last few hours of legislative session that perhaps didn't get the attention that we really should have seen given to them?
Oh, there were a few bills that toward the end of the session anyway that were kind of interesting. One that kind of got my attention was that in a time when we hear a lot about cutting back and streamlining government, the Idaho legislature created a new state agency. It was the Idaho Office of School Safety and Security, and it's not located within the something like the Idaho State Police or Homeland Security on the one hand, or the Department of Education on the other. It's located within the Division of Building Safety, which is a regulatory agency that works with contractors. Kind of interesting to see that how they did that and where they put it, and I'll be curious to hear if there's any follow-up discussion later on.
This is a board that will essentially make some decisions on perhaps how we can examine what's been done elsewhere and make some decisions on how we can make the schools a little tighter when it comes to safety.
Which could make some sense, but what we're talking about here is mainly in the area of building construction. So unless you're talking about either building a new school building or doing substantial renovation to an existing one, then those are the areas that this would primarily be involved in, as opposed to probably recommendations for major retrofits around the state.
I was going to say that we don't really have the threat of too many powerful earthquakes or hurricanes.
Well, not too much, although we've had a few. There was a huge Chalice earthquake about 3 decades ago that really rattled a lot of people. But and there are people that say that Idaho's overdue for another one.
Or the volcano, but that one goes off. I don't think we have much time to worry. So,
yeah.
Randy, I want to thank you for your time this morning. Look forward to next week.
We'll talk to you then.
Take care, sir. Randy Staples joining us this morning from Idaho Weekly Briefing, as he does on Monday mornings on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and News Radio 1310.com. Top Story with Bill Colley. In just a few minutes, news, of course, from Fox. But if we get a chance in the next hour, I just have some thoughts on. If you looked at the Drudge Report over the weekend, you would have seen nothing about all of the allegations being made against Ted Cruz. And the Drudge Report is really an unofficial, how shall we put this, campaign appendage for Donald Trump this year. That should tell us a lot about the veracity, as they say, of those allegations. And I have some thoughts about that coming up in the next hour of the program. Bill Colley with you on Top Story this morning.